The wind from the Pacific came in slow breaths, rustling the cane fields beyond the wire fence. It carried no scent of blood, no echo of gunfire, only salt, damp earth, and the hum of a quiet island morning. But to the Japanese women stepping off the transport truck, the air was heavy, heavier than the rifles that once lined their nation's shores, heavier than the silence that followed surrender. They had been taught many things in the hills of Kyushu, in the courtyards of Hiroshima, in the wards of Tokyo military hospitals. They had memorized the words of empire, the call of sacrifice, the doctrine that no American soldier would take them alive and leave them untouched. Better to die by your own hand than fall into theirs. Their superiors had whispered with trembling eyes, and now they were here, in Hawaii, in an American prisoner of war hospital. The building before them was made of wood and plaster, not iron and concrete as they had imagined. Its windows were open to the wind, and its roof, though plain, shimmered with clean rainwater under the early sun. There were no screams from inside, no chains, no guards with bayonets, just the faint sound of cloth moving, curtains brushing against window panes, and something else they could not yet place: laughter. The group was small, 9 women, most of them in their 20s, nurses, Red Cross volunteers, a school teacher conscripted to type medical records. One, the eldest, had lost her hearing in the bombing of Naha. She walked slightly behind the others, her head held high as if dignity could shield her from whatever came next. Their uniforms were soiled. Months of retreat and captivity had turned the once crisp white into the brown of jungle clay. Their shoes were threadbare. Their hands, though once trained for surgery and bandages, were calloused from digging trenches and cooking for soldiers long since dead. As they approached the hospital entrance, an American nurse stepped out. She was tall, with auburn hair tucked under a cap, and her eyes were not hard like the enemy's should have been. They were tired, gently so. She smiled. The kind of smile you might offer a stray dog near your doorstep. Not condescension, not pity. Just an opening. "Welcome," the nurse said softly, slowly, as if the word itself might frighten them. The women said nothing. Their bodies stood still, but their eyes moved, scanning the porch, the windows, the trees beyond the fence. Where were the whips? The jeers? The dogs? The nurse turned and beckoned. And the door opened, not into darkness, but light. Real light. Not flickering bulbs or interrogator's glare, but sunlight cascading through linen curtains, catching on polished floorboards, glinting off glass bottles neatly arranged on metal carts. The scent that met them was not gun oil or bleach, but soap. Warm, familiar soap. They stepped in like deer entering a clearing. The corridor was quiet. A single fan turned in the ceiling. A radio crackled gently in the background, something slow, almost like jazz, though none of the women recognized the tune. Down the hallway, they passed rooms where other prisoners rested, some wounded, some sleeping. And in one room, a young man with a bandaged leg sat up to wave at them. An American soldier. No one barked orders. No one slapped their hands if they paused. The silence was stranger than any violence might have been. The nurse led them into a side room. Clean cots, folded towels, slippers by each bed. A table stood in the center with small brown bottles arranged beside paper-wrapped parcels. One of the Japanese women leaned closer, confused. The writing was in English, but the label was familiar. Soap. Real soap. Still, no one spoke. Then another door opened, and from it came a sound that made them all freeze. Glass clinking, liquid fizzing. And then, laughter. A second American nurse stepped in. She was younger, freckled, holding a tray. On it were tall glass bottles filled with dark liquid and capped in bright red. Beads of cold water rolled down the sides. She set the tray on the table with a grin that said she knew exactly how strange this would seem. "Coca-cola," she said, motioning. No one moved. The youngest of the Japanese nurses, barely 19, stared at the bottle. She had seen the label in magazines smuggled from occupied Shanghai, always beside smiling blondes and jukeboxes. Symbols of American corruption, she had been told, of weakness. Now here it was. Cold, offered freely, with no trick, no price. The auburn-haired nurse popped the cap and handed the bottle directly to her. She accepted it with trembling hands. She took a sip. The fizz struck first, tiny stings on her tongue, then the sweetness. It rushed in like floodwater breaching a broken levee. Molasses, caramel, spice, syrup. Nothing in her memory matched it. Not tea, not sake, not even the sweet bean paste she'd loved as a child. This was something else entirely. Something alien, joyful, absurd. She looked up. The nurse nodded. "Good?" And the girl laughed. The others stared. Then they took the bottles. One by one. Tentatively at first, then eagerly. And soon, the room, just moments ago braced for shame, was filled with bubbles, sighs, and quiet giggles. No speeches were made. No flags changed hands. But something cracked. Something deep inside them, woven tight by years of fear and fury, split open like a spring thaw breaking river ice. They didn't say it aloud. But each knew. The war, for them, had truly ended in that moment. With glass in hand, with sweetness on the tongue, with an enemy who offered no bullet but a bottle. For a long while, no one spoke. The Coca-Cola bottles rested on the table, their condensation pooling into small, shining circles. The nurses, both American and Japanese, seemed to hover in a fragile truce, bound not by orders or treaties, but by something simpler, by breath, by warmth, by the sound of glass clinking against wood, unaccompanied by war. Outside, the Hawaiian air hummed with the rhythm of distant waves. Palm leaves swayed in the same wind that once carried the drone of bombers. Now, only the faint whir of ceiling fans stirred the stillness. The Japanese women sat, hands still clutching their bottles, as if letting go might shatter the fragile peace inside them. Their bodies were still rigid from habit, the back straight, knees together, eyes lowered. Decades of military obedience didn't vanish with a sip of sugar water. But something had begun to loosen, like an old knot fraying in silence. The youngest, Aki, broke first. She whispered something in Japanese, her voice small as the fizz still escaping the bottles. "What did she say?" one of the American nurses asked. The interpreter, a Nisei woman from California, drafted into service after Pearl Harbor, hesitated. She had seen the worst of both worlds. Suspicion from her homeland, distrust from her adopted one. She looked at Aki, then translated quietly. She said, "It tastes like childhood." The American nurse paused. Her eyes softened. "Then maybe that's what peace tastes like." The women smiled faintly, unsure if they were allowed to. That line lingered in the air like incense. Peace tastes like childhood. It was the kind of sentence that would live in a memory far longer than any treaty. Later that afternoon, the women were shown to their quarters. A long room with simple beds, clean sheets, and open windows. Beyond the fence, they could see the green slopes of Oahu, the sharp cut of the Pacific horizon, and the occasional shimmer of sunlight on American trucks. They weren't shackled. There were no guards in the corners, no shouted orders. Only a sign on the door. Ward 3, female convalescents. It was not what they had been told captivity would be. In the Empire's final broadcasts, America had been painted as monstrous. land of cruelty, desecration, humiliation. Yet here, nurses smiled when they entered. One even knelt to clean Aki's wound, humming softly as she worked. The song was foreign, gentle, without words. Still, the fear didn't vanish easily. When the American women offered them soap and towels, they hesitated. For years, cleanliness had been a military ritual, performed in cold water with rationed bars of gray lye. Now, they were handed perfumed soap that smelled of lavender and something else. Safety, perhaps. As the water turned warm, steam filling the bathing hut, the women felt their bodies change in ways they could not yet name. They were not soldiers anymore, not tools of the emperor, not symbols of defiance, just women, tired, scarred, alive. That night, under dim lamps, the hospital was quiet. From somewhere beyond the ward came the faint chords of a harmonica. An American soldier, likely young and homesick, played a tune that wove through the open windows like a lullaby carried by the wind. The women listened in silence. Aki lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling fan. She remembered her home in Yokohama. The smell of seaweed drying on the balcony, her mother's laughter, the radio crackling with patriotic songs. Those songs had promised glory. They had promised a sunrise that would never set. Yet the war had turned that sun into ash. Her stomach still trembled from the Coca-cola. It wasn't just the sugar. It was what it meant. That something so joyful could come from the hands of those she had been taught to fear. That something as small as a drink could cut through years of hatred more sharply than any sword. She turned her head toward the window, where the moonlight spilled across the floorboards, and whispered a prayer. Not to the emperor, but to something older, simpler. Perhaps to the ancestors who still wandered between islands and oceans, watching their children learn again how to be human. Meanwhile, in the nurses' quarters, the American women talked softly about the day. The auburn-haired one, Lieutenant Claire Whitmore, leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. She had seen men shot, burned, broken. She had treated bodies that looked more machine than human, yet nothing had touched her quite like those quiet Japanese girls taking their first sip of Coke. "It's strange," she said to the interpreter. "We fight for years, we kill each other by the thousands, and then peace arrives in the form of a bottle." The interpreter, Naomi, nodded. Sometimes peace doesn't arrive with speeches. Sometimes it sneaks in, disguised as kindness. They fell silent again. Outside, the night deepened. The island slept beneath its blanket of stars, and in the wards, the former enemies slept as well, though not yet peacefully. Dreams would still bring the faces of the dead, the sound of bombs, the sting of propaganda. Healing, like trust, would take time. But that night marked a beginning. In the quiet just before dawn, the first rays of sunlight touched the Coca-Cola bottles left empty on the table. The glass caught the light, glowing amber and gold, like relics of a new faith. Fragile, humble, and human. None of the women knew it then. But their laughter earlier that day had been heard by others in the hospital, by wounded American soldiers in nearby wards. And when they heard the sound of their former enemies laughing, not screaming, not cursing, just laughing, it softened something in them too. For in that sound, there was no empire, no propaganda, no borders, only the shared relief of survival. For the first time in months, the smell that greeted them wasn't gunpowder, rot, or antiseptic. It was soap. Simple, clean, ordinary soap. The kind that used to fill the bathhouses of Nagasaki before the world fell apart. Steam rose from a basin in the corner, where one of the American nurses was pouring hot water. Her movements were slow and careful, almost ritualistic. When she spoke, her tone carried no command, only invitation. "Come," she said softly, gesturing with a towel. The Japanese women hesitated. In their minds, the word bath still carried the ghosts of humiliation. During interrogations on Okinawa, soldiers had warned them, "The Americans will strip you, mock you, wash you in front of men." Shame had become armor. It had kept them from collapsing when hope failed. Now, in this quiet room, that armor began to feel too heavy. The eldest among them, Nakamura, the former head nurse, stepped forward. Her face was drawn, her eyes narrow with suspicion, but she held her chin high. She removed her torn uniform layer by layer until only her skin and scars remained. The nurse turned away politely, leaving privacy intact. Then she handed Nakamura the towel, as though returning something sacred. Hot water poured over her shoulders. For a moment, Nakamura's breath caught, not from fear, but from memory. She remembered her husband's hands before he left for China, the way he'd filled the wooden tub for her on winter nights, the scent of cedar, the sound of laughter echoing through their small home. Now, decades of hate and hunger seemed to dissolve with the dirt that ran down the drain. The other women followed. One by one, they stepped into the mist. Aki, the youngest, watched her reflection in the metal basin blur under the steam. She thought of her mother, of the words whispered before she left for the front. "Do not shame us, my daughter." How strange, she thought, that surrender could feel like redemption. When they returned to the ward, their hair damp, the American nurse placed folded cotton dresses on their beds. Pale blue. No insignias, no ranks, just fabric. Soft, clean, human. The women touched the cloth as if it might vanish. In the Empire's hospitals, they had worn stiff uniforms, symbols of duty and sacrifice. These dresses felt like freedom, disguised as comfort. As they changed, laughter bubbled up again, awkward, uncertain. They no longer looked like soldiers or enemies. They looked like what they had been before the war. Students, sisters, daughters. The interpreter, Naomi, entered with a clipboard and a basket of bread. "Breakfast," she said in careful Japanese. "No meat today. Oatmeal. Fruit." The word fruit made them glance at one another. It had been years since they'd seen anything fresh. In Japan, the bombings had turned markets into ash. The thought of fruit seemed like a fairy tale. Then Naomi added something that made their hearts falter. "After breakfast, the doctor will see you." The women froze. They had heard that word before, doctor. But it had meant pain, experiments, violation. The propaganda leaflets had promised that captured women would be used for American research. Nakamura whispered something sharp, warning the younger ones to stay silent, to endure whatever came. When the door opened again, the air thickened, but the man who entered was no interrogator. He was older, gray at the temples, wearing glasses instead of a pistol. He greeted them with a small bow, awkward but sincere. In one hand, he held a stethoscope. In the other, a clipboard filled with names. "Good morning," he said. His Japanese was broken but gentle. "I am Dr. Harris. I only wish to help." The interpreter relayed his words. The women said nothing, their bodies tense as coiled wire. He began his rounds, checking pulses, listening to lungs. He didn't touch without asking. He didn't stare. When he finished, he nodded to each woman and said a single phrase before leaving. "You are safe here." The words landed like stones dropped into deep water. Their ripples would take time to reach the surface. Outside, rain began to fall. It drummed softly on the roof, the kind of rain that carries a scent, the scent of earth waking up. Aki stood by the window, watching droplets race down the glass. She pressed her fingers to the cool pane, tracing their paths. For the first time since capture, she allowed herself to breathe fully. No one was shouting. No bombs fell. Even her heartbeat felt strange, as if unsure how to exist without fear. Across the ward, Nakamura sat by her cot, staring at her hands. They trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from memory. She had tended to dying soldiers in caves and tunnels, had watched boys bleed out, whispering the Emperor's name. Now her hands smelled of soap instead of blood. She looked at the younger women and spoke in a voice softened by exhaustion. "This is not what I expected." Aki turned, her eyes wide. "Do you think it's a trick?" Nakamura shook her head slowly. "No, it's worse than that." "What do you mean?" "It means they are human, and so are we." The room fell silent again. Outside, the rain eased into mist. It was then that Naomi, the interpreter, entered once more. In her hands, she carried a folded paper and a small radio. She placed both on the table. "The war," she said, "is truly over. Japan has surrendered." No one spoke. The words struck harder than any slap. Aki sank to the floor, her hands over her mouth. Nakamura stared blankly at the wall. Somewhere in the distance, a ship horn echoed through the harbor. Long, mournful, final. The war had ended, but peace felt heavier than war ever had. That night, before the lamps were dimmed, Claire, the auburn-haired nurse, walked through the ward, checking on each of them. She paused at the last bed, where Aki lay awake. "You can sleep," Claire said softly. "You're safe now." Aki looked up at her, eyes red from silent tears. She pointed at the empty Coca-Cola bottle beside her cot and whispered in broken English, "Sweet." "Like home," Claire smiled. "Yes," she said, "like home." But neither woman truly knew what home meant anymore. Morning came softly again, veiled in clouds. The rain had stopped, leaving behind the smell of wet wood and plumeria. Inside, the ward was still. Only the quiet rhythm of breathing, the shuffle of slippers on the polished floor, and the soft clink of metal trays being prepared for breakfast. Aki sat by the window, watching the guards across the yard. They weren't the monsters she had once pictured. They smoked, joked, leaned against a truck. One even laughed so loudly that a small bird startled from the fence post. The sound made her flinch, not from fear, but from confusion. In the stories she had been told, Americans had no souls. Yet here, they smiled like ordinary men. She looked down at her hands. Beneath the thin hospital dress, her skin was pale where the sun had not touched it for months. Her fingers still bore faint red lines, the rope burns from carrying stretchers through jungle mud. She traced them slowly, as if reading a script carved by war. Behind her, Nakamura was folding the linens. The act was automatic, born of habit, not instruction. In the Empire's hospitals, discipline had been survival. Even in defeat, she found comfort in order. "Come eat," Naomi said gently, setting a bowl on the table. Rice, fruit, and a small piece of bread. Simple, abundant compared to the starvation rations they had endured. As they ate, one of the American nurses entered. Not Lieutenant Whitmore this time, but a younger girl with sandy hair and bright eyes. She carried something wrapped in cloth. "Gift," she said, smiling, her Japanese limited to that single word. She unwrapped the bundle. Inside were sewing needles, thread, scraps of fabric. The women stared. For years they had sewn torn uniforms, stitched wounds, patched tents. Now they were being offered the same tools not for war, but for creation. Aki reached out first, touching the spool of blue thread. It gleamed in the sunlight like a thin river. "For us?" she asked. The nurse nodded. "Yes, You sew, whatever you like, whatever you like. The words were foreign. Freedom still felt dangerous. By afternoon, the ward had changed. Laughter, quiet, hesitant, returned. Two of the women began hemming dresses. One mended a curtain near the window. Aki stitched tiny flowers into the hem of her sleeve, something she hadn't done since childhood. The sound of the needle pulling through fabric mingled with the rustle of palm trees outside. It was a sound of peace so fragile that no one dared to speak too loudly, afraid it might disappear. Lieutenant Whitmore passed through carrying a clipboard, her expression tired but kind. She paused by their table, watching the stitches form. "Beautiful," she said softly. "Reminds me of home." Naomi translated. Aki smiled faintly. "We forgot what beauty is," she said in Japanese. Naomi hesitated, then translated anyway. Whitmore's eyes grew wet, but she said nothing. She simply nodded and placed a small bar of chocolate beside Aki's sewing. "For when you remember again," it melted a little in the warmth of her hand. That evening, the doctor came once more. Dr. Harris, his steps slow, his face weary from tending the wounded. He carried a notebook and a folded newspaper. When he spoke, it was half to himself. "Tokyo, gone," he murmured, showing Naomi the headline. The others leaned closer. Black ink on white paper. Hiroshima destroyed. Nagasaki lost. No one breathed. The words hung heavier than any bomb could. Naomi hesitated to translate, but Harris gave a nod. Truth could not be hidden. When the meaning reached them, the women's faces turned white. One clutched her stomach. Another whispered the name of her child. Nakamura sat motionless, her eyes fixed on the wall as if she could see through it. Across the sea, across the ruins. "Why?" Aki asked at last, voice breaking. "Why did you burn us?" No one answered. The nurse lowered her gaze. Harris removed his glasses and wiped them, though they were already clean. Finally, he said quietly, "Because war blinds everyone. Both sides believe they are saving the world. And then the world burns." His voice trembled. "I'm sorry." It wasn't the apology of a nation, just one man's sorrow. Yet it carried more truth than any government speech ever could. The women cried silently. Not for the empire, not for victory lost, but for the small, ordinary lives erased beneath those headlines. For mothers, for children, for the smell of rice cooking in kitchens that no longer stood. When the sobbing subsided, Aki whispered, "I thought I hated you." She looked at Harris. "But now, I don't know what to feel." He nodded. "That is the beginning of peace." Night fell heavy. The radio hummed softly in the hall, playing a slow American ballad. Naomi sat near the doorway, translating the lyrics to those who listened. "When the night is long and hope is gone, the morning still remembers you." Some of the women began to hum along, their voices fragile but steady. Outside, the moon rose, full, white, unbothered by nations. Its light slipped through the windows, resting on the Coca-Cola bottles still lined on the shelf. They gleamed faintly, as if holding the last remnants of laughter, sweetness, and something else. Forgiveness, perhaps. Before the lamps went out, Nakamura spoke softly to the younger ones. "We were told the Americans would strip us of honor," she said. "But honor is not taken. It is given. When one chooses to be kind." Her voice trembled. "And tonight, I think, they have given some back." The others nodded in silence. Outside, the surf whispered against the dark shore, the eternal sound of the Pacific erasing footprints and sorrow alike. In the stillness that followed, Aki lay awake, clutching the blue thread she'd sewn earlier. It shimmered faintly in the moonlight. a fragile bridge between what was lost and what might still be saved. Morning brought warmth, not just in sunlight, but in gesture. Lieutenant Claire Whitmore arrived before breakfast. She wasn't in uniform. Today she wore a plain dress, navy blue, pressed but simple. The kind of dress a woman might wear to church or to a dance before the war. She carried a package wrapped in newspaper and tied with twine. Naomi followed closely behind, a bit hesitant. "She wants to show you something," Naomi said in Japanese, glancing at Aki and Nakamura. "Something from her home." Whitmore untied the twine. Inside were photographs, black and white, soft at the edges, slightly yellowed by time. One showed a farmhouse beneath trees. Another, a young boy with a missing front tooth, grinning on a porch swing. The last was a group of women, nurses, all American, standing in front of a Red Cross tent. "This is my son," Claire said, pointing to the boy. "He's 7. His name is Henry." She paused, then added quietly, "He doesn't know what the word enemy means yet." The women leaned in. They had not seen a photograph of a child in months. Most had no idea if their own families still lived, if Tokyo still stood, if brothers still drew breath in the rubble of Okinawa. The boy's gap-toothed smile pierced something in them. Aki touched the photo gently. "He looks like my cousin," she whispered. Claire smiled. "Then maybe someday, your cousin and Henry will build a world where they don't need to fight." After breakfast, the sewing continued, but it was no longer mere busy work. Now, the scraps of cloth were shaped into something more. Gifts, small bags, hair ribbons, embroidered handkerchiefs. One woman crafted a simple doll, stuffing it with cotton from discarded bandages. She stitched button eyes, a crooked smile. When she finished, she looked up and asked Naomi to give it to Claire. "She has a child," the woman said. "This is what mothers do." Claire accepted the doll with both hands. Her voice caught. "I haven't cried in front of a patient in 3 years," she said softly, wiping her eyes. "But today, I think it's allowed." The room filled with a silence that wasn't empty, but full. A quiet charged with understanding. The blue thread, the doll, the photographs, each was a strand, thin, fragile, connecting 2 worlds separated by fire and ocean. Later that afternoon, something unexpected happened. A jeep arrived outside the ward, kicking up dust on the gravel path. 2 American officers stepped out, one older, square-jawed with a chest full of ribbons. The other younger, clearly nervous. They were not from the hospital. Naomi stepped forward, tense. So did Claire. The older officer looked around the room, at the women, the sewing, the calm. His face betrayed no emotion. "I'm Colonel James Weller," he said, voice clipped. "We're conducting an inspection of civilian POW facilities on Oahu." Claire nodded. "Of course, Colonel. This is Ward 3. Female Japanese prisoners, non-combatants, convalescent." Weller looked at the Coca-Cola bottles still lined on the shelf. He raised an eyebrow. "You've been giving them luxuries?" "They've been giving us something back," Claire said firmly. "Grace." Weller walked the room slowly. He stopped beside Aki, who stood quickly, bowing out of habit. He looked down at her sewing, then at her eyes. "How long were you a nurse?" he asked. Naomi translated. Aki answered in a whisper. "Since I was 16, first at Hiroshima General, then the front." Weller didn't speak. He simply gave a short nod, then turned to leave. At the door, he paused. "Keep the Coca-Cola. You never know what small things start peace." And then he was gone. That night, a storm came in from the ocean. Not violent, but strong enough to rattle the shutters. Rain fell in thick sheets, drowning out the usual sounds of radio static and laughter. But the women didn't sleep restlessly. They lay in their cots, listening to the wind. Nakamura turned to Aki. "You must write," she said. "Write what?" Aki whispered. "A letter. To your family. If they're alive, they should know what happened here." Aki hesitated. She hadn't written in over a year. Her last letter was sealed with military censorship. It had begun with praise for the emperor, ended with apologies for her absence, and left out the hunger, the deaths, the jungle rot. Now she reached for a pencil. The paper shook in her hand. But slowly, she began. "To my mother, I am not dead. I am in Hawaii, in a place where they give us soap and Coca-cola and even music. The Americans are not what we were told. They do not humiliate us. They care for us. They bandage our wounds. They treat us like women. I don't know how to understand it. But I think, perhaps, there is still goodness in the world." When she finished, she cried, not from sorrow, but from the strange, tender ache of speaking truth. Elsewhere in the ward, the bottle of Coca-cola that Claire had brought earlier still sat unopened on the table. No one had touched it. It was no longer just a drink. It was a relic now. A monument to the moment fear broke. A moment when one sip had undone years of hatred. It sat quietly in the dark, rain tapping against the glass, waiting for dawn. And when dawn came, the clouds had parted. The sky was clear. The women began their day not with orders, but with ink. Aki's letter to her mother had inspired the others. By mid-morning, nearly every woman in the ward held a pencil in trembling fingers. Naomi moved between them gently, offering help when someone forgot how to spell, or paused too long over a word like alive or home. They wrote in silence. Not the silence of obedience, the silence of memory. One woman wrote to her brother, missing since Iwo Jima. Another to a fiancé she feared had married someone else. One simply wrote, "I have not seen the moon since the last time I kissed you." Claire entered quietly with a small bundle of envelopes. "We'll send them out by transport," she said. "Through the Red Cross, no guarantees. But we'll try." No guarantees. The phrase hung in the air like smoke. Nakamura folded her letter slowly. She looked at Claire and asked, through Naomi, "Do you think they'll believe us? That we are treated kindly here?" Claire paused. "Maybe not. But truth is like water. It always finds a way in." Later that afternoon, the women were taken outside for the first time since arriving. A garden sat beyond the ward. Small, modest, fenced. It had been tended quietly by the wounded soldiers who were too injured for combat, but still able to pull weeds, plant vegetables, water flowers. It wasn't meant for prisoners. But today, it became a sanctuary. The women knelt beside rows of marigolds and green onions. Aki cupped a tiny tomato in her hands as if it were a newborn bird. Nakamura ran her fingers through the soil, murmuring something about her family's farm near Sendai. It was the first time any of them had touched the earth in months without digging for graves or trenches. Claire stood beneath a banyan tree, arms crossed, watching them. The interpreter, Naomi, stood beside her. "Do they remind you of home?" Claire asked. Naomi nodded slowly. "Yes, and also of what we lost." Claire looked toward the women. "What do you think they'll remember about this place? Years from now, when they're old?" Naomi was quiet for a moment. Then she answered, "The taste of sweetness, the weight of soap, and the moment they were allowed to cry without shame." Back inside, the ward grew quieter as the afternoon faded. One of the women, Michiko, developed a fever. A red flush crept across her cheeks, her breathing grew shallow, and she began to mumble in her sleep. Fragments of Japanese poems and names of those long dead. The American staff responded swiftly. Dr. Harris sat by her cot for hours. He read her temperature, cooled her brow, whispered calming words she could not understand. He did not speak of sides, only symptoms, only care. The women of Ward 3 watched this in silence. Some prayed softly. Aki held Michiko's hand, whispering verses from old lullabies, songs they used to sing in school before the war turned every melody into a march. Claire brought broth. Naomi translated orders. No one asked if the effort was worth it. No one needed to. This, perhaps more than anything, was what undid them. That the enemy would fight so hard to save just one of them. That night, Michiko's fever broke. The women exhaled like soldiers hearing the all-clear siren after a bombing raid. They surrounded her bed, not as prisoners, not as Japanese, but simply as women, caretakers of one another. Claire and Naomi stood at the edge of the room, their faces tired but filled with something deeper than duty. "Do you think she'll make it?" Naomi asked. Claire nodded. "Yes, she's stronger than she looks." Naomi studied her friend's face, then asked quietly, "What about the others?" Claire didn't answer right away. She looked at the sleeping women, curled in thin blankets, the moonlight on their faces, the faint rustle of cotton dresses breathing with each rise and fall of their chests. "I think they're starting to remember who they were before the uniforms," she said. Before lights out, Aki returned to her letter. She opened the folded paper, reread the lines, and added a final sentence at the bottom. "Today, an American doctor saved Michiko's life. He wiped her forehead like he might have done for his own daughter. I don't understand it, but I think I'm beginning to." Then she folded the paper again, tucked it into an envelope, and placed it into the collection Naomi would send off at week's end. She knew it might never arrive. Tokyo was ash. The sea was wide, and war had a habit of swallowing even the most heartfelt truths. But still, she wrote it. Because in that letter lived something that could not be bombed or burned or censored. Hope. As the lights dimmed, Nakamura whispered across the darkened room, "Do you know what day it is?" "No," Aki replied softly. Nakamura smiled into the darkness. "It's Sunday. Do you remember what Sundays were?" Aki thought. She remembered market stalls, the smell of grilled fish, her mother hanging linens out to dry, the shriek of neighborhood children playing beside the temple walls. She nodded. "I remember." Nakamura exhaled. "Then maybe, after all this, we still have something left to return to." Outside, the sea whispered against the island's edge. It did not ask who won or lost. It simply moved. Inside Ward 3, the unopened Coca-cola bottle still sat untouched, not forgotten, preserved, like memory, like proof that sweetness was still possible in a world that had burned. It began with a broom. Private First Class Daniel Ruiz, a young guard barely old enough to shave, stood near the front porch of the ward as usual. His rifle slung across his back, helmet tight, posture stiff. But on this morning, something had shifted in him. Maybe it was the clear sky. Maybe it was the way the Japanese women had begun to greet him, not warmly, not with friendship, but with eyes no longer full of terror. So he grabbed a broom and started sweeping. It wasn't his job. But the wind had scattered leaves across the pathway, and no one else seemed to care. He swept in silence, head down, occasionally glancing up to see the faces behind the screen windows, watching him. At first, the women inside were confused. Why would an armed guard sweep like a servant? But then, Aki whispered something to Nakamura. "He is not sweeping for us. He is sweeping for the ground." And Nakamura understood. He was restoring order to something broken. Later that day, more guards followed suit. One removed his helmet and placed it on the porch rail while he rolled up his sleeves to carry water buckets to the garden. Another, an older man, Sergeant Willows, helped an injured soldier to the mess hall, then stayed to assist the kitchen crew peeling potatoes. The women of Ward 3 watched from their open windows, sewing in their laps, silence in their mouths. but thunder in their minds. These men were not what they'd been trained to expect. They were tired, pale from worry, homesick in a way that mirrored their own hearts. Some had children, some had scars, some looked like the brothers they had buried. "Why are they doing this?" one of the women asked Naomi. Naomi thought for a long moment before answering. "Because sometimes, when war ends, it takes people a while to realize they're allowed to be human again." By afternoon, Lieutenant Whitmore returned carrying a bundle of clothing. Fresh laundry, newly issued dresses in warmer colors. The hospital seamstress had taken the measurements Aki and the others submitted last week. And for the first time, the uniforms they were given weren't made to erase their identities, but to fit them as individuals. Soft yellows, light gray, faint stripes of pink. Aki held hers up against her body, unsure how to feel. It was lovely, and that frightened her. She turned to Claire. "Why do you give us beauty?" Claire didn't answer right away. She looked Aki in the eyes, then said, "Because beauty reminds us that we're more than what the war made us." The real moment, however, came just before dinner. A jeep rolled up. Not an officer this time, but a local Hawaiian woman from the American Red Cross. In her hands were 2 large boxes wrapped in cloth. She entered the ward with a gentle smile, nodding toward Naomi. "I brought something from the town," she said. The women here, Japanese-American women, they heard about the POW nurses and wanted to send a gift. The box opened. Inside were hand-woven slippers. Dozens of them, different colors, sizes. Each pair wrapped in rice paper with a tiny red flower tucked inside. The women froze. These were not American-made. These were familiar. The stitching pattern, the delicate shape. These were the kind of slippers you found in the markets of Kyoto, the alleys of Osaka, the temples of Gifu. Handmade. Personal, Claire explained. They were made by Japanese women living here in Hawaii. Some of them had husbands in the U.S. Army. Some had brothers in internment camps. Aki covered her mouth. She had forgotten that there were Japanese who lived in America. Forgotten that the same war that tore her life apart had torn theirs too, in a different way. She picked up one pair and whispered, "This is what forgiveness looks like." That night, before lights out, something unexpected happened again. Sergeant Willows returned to the ward with a small crate. Inside were records, music. He had borrowed them from the rec tent where American GIs danced and drank on Saturday nights. He held one up awkwardly. "Any of you ever heard Benny Goodman?" The women shook their heads, unsure whether this was a test or a trap. Willows placed the record on the phonograph, cranked the handle, and placed the needle down. The static crackled. Then came a clarinet, smooth and sharp, like sunlight bouncing off the sea. Swing. At first, the rhythm confused them. It didn't march. It danced. It didn't chant war. It hummed joy. Aki swayed unconsciously. Michiko, still weak from her fever, tapped her fingers. Even Nakamura smiled, just barely. "They don't march like we do," she said softly. "They float." In that moment, the war felt far away. Not forgotten. Never that. But distant. Like the memory of a fever dream finally breaking. The guards didn't leave right away. They stood outside the ward, listening to the music, helmets off, arms crossed. Enemies once. Now, just men trying to remember how to exist in peace. Inside, the women of Ward 3 sat on their beds, slippers on their feet, blue thread in their sleeves, letters in their pockets. A single Coca-Cola bottle still gleamed faintly in the corner. Untouched, yes, but never unnoticed. Because peace, they had learned, doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it sweeps the porch. Sometimes it smells like old slippers. And sometimes It sounds like Benny Goodman on a borrowed phonograph. The next morning brought with it something strange. Restlessness, not the kind that came from fear or uncertainty. This was different. It was the ache of muscles that had been still too long. It was the quiet hum in the heart that whispered, "You are still alive." Nakamura stood by the doorway, watching the sea beyond the palm trees, her spine straight. She looked less like a prisoner today, and more like the senior nurse she had once been. The woman who barked orders in dim-lit tents during bombing raids, who wrapped wounded boys with trembling hands, but never let them see her tremble. She turned to Claire. "We should be working." Claire blinked. "You are recovering. We are still nurses," Nakamura said. "Let us work." It wasn't a demand. It was a plea to have purpose again. And so they did. That afternoon, with the hospital's cautious blessing, the women of Ward 3 were given white aprons and assigned light duties in the convalescent ward. They changed linens, folded bandages, cleaned trays. It was the first time since surrender that they had touched the bodies of men. Some of those men had fought in the Philippines, in Guadalcanal, in Saipan. Some had seen their comrades fall to the very empire these women once served. Now they lay with missing limbs, sunken cheeks, scars like rivers across their torsos. But the women did not flinch. They bowed quietly, checked pulses, refilled water glasses. One soldier, young, blonde, a fresh bandage on his temple, looked up at Aki and said, "Thank you." She didn't understand the words at first. Naomi repeated them gently in Japanese. Aki bowed. And for the first time, she smiled not out of politeness, but from something much deeper. Recognition. These were not enemies anymore. They were wounded souls, like her. Back in Ward 3, the sewing table had turned into something new. A workshop. The women began crafting small items to give to the American staff. Bookmarks stitched with delicate cranes, cloth pouches, embroidered handkerchiefs, with initials they'd learned to write in English. Naomi acted as their tutor. "C is for Claire," she said, drawing the letter. "Like Coca-cola," Aki added. The women laughed. The name had become legend. The bottle still stood untouched, but no longer sacred, just precious. A reminder of the day fear had melted like ice in sunlight. But not everything was easy. One afternoon, a new American soldier was wheeled into the recovery ward. His name was Corporal Ellis. His leg had been shattered by a Japanese mortar shell on Iwo Jima. When he saw Nakamura approach with a basin of water, he snarled, "Keep that Jap away from me." The room froze. Claire moved quickly, taking the basin from Nakamura's hands. "I'll handle it," she said. But Nakamura didn't move. Her eyes didn't narrow. Her voice didn't rise. She simply bowed, not in submission, but in respect, and walked quietly away. Later, Naomi found her outside, sitting on the back steps, her face unreadable. "I wanted to shout," Nakamura said, "to remind him I once held the hands of dying boys too. That blood is red on both sides. But I didn't." "Why not?" "Because war took his leg. I will not let it take his heart too." Naomi sat beside her in silence. The wind blew gently through the banyan leaves above them. That evening, Lieutenant Whitmore brought news. "There's talk of repatriation," she said. "Some of you may go home in the next few weeks. Japan is reopening." The room fell still. Home. That word again. Once a beacon, now a shadow. Aki asked, "What if our homes are gone?" Claire paused. "Then you will carry them in your memory. And begin again," Naomi translated, and the words hit like quiet thunder. Begin again. Was it truly possible? Could one leave a war and not carry it forever? That night, Aki stood before the Coca-cola bottle again. She picked it up gently. Its glass was cool. The label slightly faded, the metal cap still sealed. She thought of that first day. when the fizz had danced on her tongue and something sweet had stolen away her fear. She thought of the laughter, the steam, the soap, the swing music, the slippers, the silence, the forgiveness. She turned to Claire. "Will you do something for me?" "Of course." Aki handed her the bottle. "Give it to the museum, or to the children. I don't need to drink it again. I already know what it tastes like." Claire nodded, tears rising. "What does it taste like?" she asked softly. Aki didn't hesitate. "It tastes like remembering we are human." As the ward fell into sleep, that bottle sat in Claire's hands, not as a relic of American power, nor as a novelty drink in an army hospital, but as a bridge from enemy to nurse, from fear to peace, from silence to song. Outside, the Pacific shimmered beneath the moon, just as it had before the war, and just as it would long after. And in that shimmer, in the stillness of Ward 3, the taste of America lingered. Not on the tongue, but in the soul. It came without ceremony, the list, typed in a cramped office 2 barracks over, marked with creased signatures, clipped to a clipboard with trembling fingers. Naomi entered the ward late that morning, the list folded in half, her expression unreadable. "They've selected 10 women," she said, "to return to Japan." No one moved. For months, the women of Ward 3 had existed in a world suspended between 2 oceans. No longer soldiers, not yet civilians, watched over by the enemy who had become something else entirely. Now, the bridge they had carefully built was beginning to narrow. And soon, it would end. Naomi began reading the names aloud. Aki. She looked up. Aki froze. Nakamura. No reaction. Michiko. A breath caught in the room. The list continued. Names spoken with gravity, like a priest reading prayers for the dead. When the final name was spoken, half the ward had been chosen. "You leave in 3 days," Naomi said. The ward fell into a strange silence. Not joy, not sadness. Something heavier. Something that clung to the skin like humidity. That evening, Aki walked the garden path slowly, her fingers grazing the tops of the marigolds. Claire followed behind her, a clipboard in one hand, a stack of small cloth bundles in the other. Gifts from the hospital staff. Soap, bandages, vitamins, letters of safe passage. They walked without speaking until they reached the low bench beneath the banyan tree. Aki sat first. "I should be happy," she said, "but I feel like I'm abandoning something." Claire sat beside her, silent. Aki looked down at her hands. "I left Japan in a uniform. I was ready to die for an emperor I'd never met. And now I return with a dress sewn by American nurses and thread from your stores." She looked up, her eyes shining. "What will my people say when I tell them I was not tortured? That I was treated with kindness?" Claire's reply was quiet. "They'll say you were lucky, or they won't believe you." "And they'll be wrong?" Claire shook her head. "No. But the truth is sometimes heavier than silence." Back in the ward, the others packed slowly. Not because they had much. A pair of slippers, a folded towel, the clothes on their backs. But because each item had become sacred. The soft cotton dress, the bar of soap with a lavender scent, a photograph of Claire's son, Henry, tucked between pages of a blank journal. That night, Nakamura gathered the departing women. "We will not forget this place," she said, "but we must leave with honor, the way we did not arrive." The women nodded, understanding without speaking. Not one of them had expected to feel sorrow for leaving a place guarded by the enemy. The next morning, the women awoke before sunrise. Claire and Naomi waited on the porch, joined by Sergeant Willows and Private Ruiz. No rifles, no helmets, just eyes that could not meet theirs without watering. A small transport truck idled near the gate. Naomi handed each woman a small envelope. Inside, A letter of transit, written in Japanese and English. Claire gave Aki one last gift, a tin of thread and needles. "You'll rebuild? You'll sew again," she said. "Maybe not uniforms this time." Aki looked down at the tin, then at Claire. "You taught me how to stitch again," she said. But not just fabric. They embraced. A quiet, trembling thing. No tears. Not until the others turned away. Nakamura bowed low to Dr. Harris. "You healed more than wounds," she said. "You restored our dignity." He bowed back. "You gave me back my faith in medicine." And then, the final moment. Claire retrieved something from the shelf. The Coca-cola bottle. Still sealed, still sacred. She placed it in Aki's hands. "I want you to have it." Aki shook her head. "No, you must keep it." Claire smiled. "Then let's do this. We'll bury it together. Here. So we both leave it behind." Aki agreed. They walked to the base of the banyan tree, dug a small hollow, wrapped the bottle in cloth, placed it beneath the earth. No stone, no plaque, just memory. The truck pulled away at 800 hours. From the porch of Ward 3, the remaining women watched it vanish down the gravel road. In the back of the truck, Aki sat with her hands clasped in her lap. The thread tin rested beside her. She looked back only once. Claire raised her hand, and for the first time, Aki waved. That night, the ward was quiet again. Half the beds empty, half the laughter gone. Naomi sat on her cot, reading a letter left behind by one of the departing nurses. It ended with a single line. "We arrived as enemies. We left as something harder to explain." Claire sat beneath the banyan tree long after lights out, her fingers tracing the soil where the bottle now lay. Peace, she thought, didn't come with parades. It came with questions, with contradictions, with grace that didn't demand applause. And somewhere far across the sea, a ship carried Aki home. Not to the same Japan she had left, but to a future she would help stitch back together, one thread at a time. The days that followed unfolded with a strange stillness. The remaining women moved through the ward with slower steps, not because of fatigue, but reverence. Each corner, each bed, each bowl of rice now held echoes of laughter and grief, of whispered apologies, of letters never answered. Nakamura, still recovering from the sting of goodbye, rose earlier than usual each morning. She stood on the porch just as the sky began to shift from navy to amber, the colors of dawn bleeding through the clouds like watercolor. She no longer feared the guards. In truth, she now greeted them with small nods. And sometimes, on the rarest mornings, Private Ruiz tipped his cap and left a folded newspaper near the steps. It was in those quiet hours that she began to speak softly to the banyan tree. Not prayers, not rituals, just words. Words she hadn't said aloud since Japan's surrender. "I forgive you. Please forgive me. Let the past remain in the ground." Claire noticed the change too. The ward felt less like a place of holding and more like a space of recovery, of dignity. One afternoon, she approached Naomi with an idea. "I want to write about them," she said. "Not their names, not their ranks, just what happened here, quietly." Naomi raised her eyes. "You want to tell the story?" Claire hesitated. "Yes, but not for the press, not for a medal, for Henry, for my son. So that he grows up understanding peace isn't something generals declare. It's something ordinary people build, one gesture at a time." Naomi nodded. "Then let's write it together." And so they did. Two women, one from Iowa, one from Kyoto, sat together on the porch each evening, recording the days of Ward 3. They wrote about Aki's blue thread, about the slippers from the Japanese-American women in Honolulu, about the dolls sewn from bandages, about Michiko's fever, and how Dr. Harris held her hand. They even drew a small map of the garden. And at the bottom of one page, in careful script, Naomi wrote, "Under the banyan tree, We buried a bottle. Not because we were thirsty, but because we had tasted something too sacred to keep above ground. On the 7th night after Aki's departure, something unexpected happened. The guards gathered around the edge of the ward just after dinner. Sergeant Willows, Private Ruiz, a handful of others who had watched the transformation of these women not from command towers, but from the garden paths and laundry lines. One of them carried a guitar, another a harmonica. They didn't ask permission. They simply began to play. Not military hymns, not marches, but soft, slow songs from the American South. Melodies of longing, of lost love, of rain falling on tin roofs. The women stepped onto the porch. Drawn by the sound, some stood. One leaned against a post. Another closed her eyes. And when Claire handed Nakamura a harmonica, she didn't refuse. She didn't play it either. She simply held it to her chest, as if recognizing that even the breath of an old enemy could become music. The final act of the ward came not with drums, but with fabric. The remaining women had sewn one final gift, a quilt. It was made from leftover hospital sheets, scraps of their dresses, even pieces of the thread Aki had left behind. Each square told a story: a crane, a banyan leaf, a bottle, a slipper, a tear. They gave it to Claire without ceremony. She unfolded it slowly, her eyes widening with every pattern. I can't accept this, she said. Nakamura placed a hand gently on her arm. It is not a gift, she said. It is a witness. Claire understood, and she wept. On their final day at the hospital, before the remaining women were transferred to a different facility for repatriation processing, Naomi gathered them once more beneath the banyan tree. They stood in a circle around the patch of soil where the bottle was buried. No words were spoken at first, only the sound of birds in the branches. Then one woman bent down, pressed her palm to the earth, and whispered, "Thank you for changing the taste of war." The others followed. Some knelt, some cried, and one simply stared into the canopy above, as if searching for the souls of all those lost on both sides. Souls who never lived to see the quiet that now enveloped them. That night, after the transport truck departed once more, Claire walked to the tree alone. She sat on the bench Aki once favored, and in her hands she held Henry's photograph. She whispered to it, "One day I'll tell you about the bottle, about the thread, about the enemies who became healers. You'll think it sounds like a dream." She smiled, tears on her cheek. "But it happened, sweetheart. I was there." She stood, walked back toward the ward. The wind rustled the branches. The ground held its secret. And beneath the banyan tree in Hawaii, the story of Ward 3 rested, buried not to be forgotten, but to be remembered in silence, where sweetness once met sorrow, and humanity chose to rise.